Hello, world of YouTube, and welcome to another episode of AVA, the Album versus Album podcast, ran by yours truly. For those who don't know, my name is Johnny, but a portion of the internet knows me as Viral Rack. And I do want to apologize up front. We don't have a special guest joining us this week. It's another solo cast, but it kind of gives me a chance to do a couple of things. First off, the biggest reason why I did not get a guest, even though I did have one lined up to do an episode with, I was trying to find two albums that I could really discuss with that particular person with. And I think you guys will enjoy the podcast with this particular guest, because I think that it's kind of one that feels ceremonious, if you know me and podcasts in the past. But it also gives any listeners or potential future guests a chance to kind of get a peek at what a real episode's going to feel like. Because a pilot, that's me kind of spreading my wings, trying to find my footing, and make an example. It's a proof of concept, and this is sort of an expanding on that, because the format, this is really what the format's going to be. It's going to be kind of an intro, kind of a discussion, maybe a little behind-the-scenes talk. You guys already know why. Another reason why I'm flying solo again this week. I had the move a week ago. I dropped the mixtape a week before that. So I've had a lot on my plate on top of running the channel and running a full-time job on the main grind. But normally how this will go is it'll be an intro, like what I've been doing now, before transitioning into talking about the comments left on the last podcast episode, expanding on those with maybe some extensive thoughts that I may have about them, all that sort of stuff, before we dive into the meat of the episode, which are discussing the two albums at hand. I will let you know the two albums I have at hand are two iconic New York 2000s rock records, talking about their impact, their sound, and which I personally enjoy for reasons that I'll get into, as far as not only the sound but the influence and all that sort of stuff, but not without giving a fair chance to both sides. But before I dive into that, like I said, we're going to go back and look at the comments from the pilot episode of the podcast, which, for those who missed the last podcast, it'll be linked in the description as always. And the podcast itself was on two iconic 90s rock albums, which had the longest resonance. And the albums up for debate were Blue, Weezer's Blue, and Nirvana's Nevermind. The podcast itself has two comments on the YouTube version of it, the only version that's out there, because I don't have this on any other social media or any other streaming platforms. But comments, the first comment that was posted was by Kyle Hegedus. I apologize if I got that incorrect, but they said, some could argue that Pinkerton topped Blue, which is a comment I assumed I would get, because that's always a point of contention with Weezer fans. You know, some just like Pinkerton more. And the reason why that I didn't include Pinkerton in place of Blue is, one, I like Pinkerton more, but also you could argue in its time, Blue was still more resonant than Pinkerton was in its time. I don't think the bands that took influence from Weezer were taking influence from Pinkerton. I like Pinkerton, don't get me wrong. It's like my second favorite Weezer record. I'm one of those guys. I prefer Blue more, but I think Blue's production, the guitars, the catchier hooks, the songwriting as a whole lended itself more to the influence from bands that I talked about in the last episode. You know, I could see somebody finding Pinkerton having the same level of resonance, but I feel like in terms of the subject of the show, talking about in context of its release, I feel like Blue was just a more resonant album, personally. And then the other comment was a lovely comment by longtime viewer Ryan Schilling, who had said that Blue, to their ears, is an album that they enjoy more. It's their fave album of the 90s. They like Nirvana and they Foo Fighters, but they're just a bigger Weezer fan for some of the reasons that I talked about in the episode. They're a nerd. They obsess over things, and they said specifically The World Has Turned and Left Us is the best song of the 90s easily. Now, I don't hold that song to as high of a caliber, but it is a great song on a great album, Blue. But that Pinkerton question is one that I knew I was going to get, because anybody, you ask a Weezer fan, and they got one of two albums typically as their favorite. It's either Blue or it's Pinkerton. And again, I could see some finding traces of Pinkerton in other bands, or you could find an interview where somebody said that they actually liked Pinkerton back in the day, and that's fine. I think the production on Pinkerton isn't as crisp, isn't as clean as it is on Blue, that I feel like would have led to bands like Jimmy Eat World, or, again, bands like Fall Out Boy to kind of borrow certain ideas from Weezer and transition it into their own sound. But I appreciate the comments. I appreciate any feedback you guys want to give the podcast, any contributions you want to make to the conversation. That's what this whole first part of the show is really about. Now, before I get into the subject of today's episode, I just want to thank you all so very much for listening, and I want to thank you all for contributing to the podcast and giving us your ears to chew on for a little while we talk about music. And the subject of today's podcast are two records from the 2000s that were incredibly influential, and also from the same area. They both came out a year apart from each other, and they are both very detrimental to the rock scenes in the 2000s, their own respective rock scenes, as it were. And I've had people ask me why I didn't pick this record or that record, or why I picked these two specific records. And it's partially because they are from the same area, but also because they came out earlier in the decade than other albums, and that had also been big influencers in the scene. I'm talking about the debut records from The Strokes and Interpol, Is This It? And Turn on the Bright Lights. And both of these records are super influential to their respective scenes. They weren't the only bands to make sounds like this. You could argue the White Stripes also had a lot of contributions to similar ideas that the Strokes are toying with on this project, but I feel like the Strokes did a great job at standing apart, adjacent from the noisier stripped-back tendencies of the White Stripes to create their own niche within the genre that had a bigger resonance. Because I love Jack White, I love Meg White. You guys know the White Stripes, one of my favorite bands of all time. However, if you look at the influence that the Strokes had on this record, I mean, it's something that's also become kind of its own joke in the scene because of one of the influences that had in this band, but I'll get to that in a bit. The records themselves, both seemingly very indicative of New York City in two very different ways, because The Strokes is this much more buoyant, lively, sort of energetic rock album that has lots of full, playful, again, almost not punk-laden, but punkier aspects to their sounds, whereas Interpol's Turn on the Bright Lights is so much more drenched in reverb and sadness. It's not without its energetic moments, like PDA or Say Hello to the Angels, but it's not like, Last Night or New York City Cops or parts of Someday. It's a different beast altogether that had its own resonant influence in the scene, And again, people could, argue, well, why not, Kings of Leon or Franz Ferdinand or The Killers or Block Party or The Libertines, and those are all great ideas. But if you look at the bloodline those bands had, they really, outside of older influences that Interpol and Interpol and the Strokes pull from, these two records are the two. They just presented this sound that was very needed in rock music, and that's why I picked them. I thought about making it a little more in line with genres, like talking about either like White Blood Cells and Is This It, or Turn on the Bright Lights and Silent Alarm, but it just didn't feel right. And I think, again, it's because these two are both Manhattan bands. They both had this fresh spin on an old sound that made it so electrifying when it came out. And, sorry, I'm taking a big boy sippy. I'm recording this at 2:20 in the morning, if that gives you any indication of how dry my throat probably is after a long day's work and any sort of wind downs I may have had after that. But also, this is not my first take of the podcast, if that gives you any indication. But Is This It, just to kind of put it up there first, is so electrifying. It has this whimsical opening of Is This It before bleeding into this modern age that just launches the record into this, gene-clad, guitar-filled, boisterous, fun time full of great bass lines, tight drum grooves, and catchy-ass choruses, like some of the tracks I mentioned before, like This Modern Age, Someday, and Last Night. This record, it again, took some of the ideas that you may be able to see in some of the Midwestern Americana influences from Jack White and Meg White's sounds from the White Stripes and made it much more buoyant, much more full. And I think it's because they had a full fucking band. But if we're talking about sounds themselves, they also took influence from, the Ramones at certain points, or other old garage rock bands, of their day. They did a good job at interpreting those old school garage rock sounds and making them feel so fresh, thanks to Gordon Raphael's production as well. It's interesting to see just how different this felt, because not only does everything sound so tight and full, it has its own contemporary twist with the incorporation of stuff like drum machine, something that kind of Turn on the Bright Lights has an edge on, but it helps lend itself to that dance-driven nature that you would see bands like LCD Sound System explore in their albums, And again, LCD Sound System obviously influenced by other bands like the Talking Heads and stuff like that. But again, just the production on this record seemingly bled through the scene of the time with bands that I had mentioned, Arctic Monkeys, the joke on their last record, I Just Wanted to Be One of the Strokes, Franz Ferdinand and the Libertines, and I'm trying to think, the other band from the UK, the Kaiser Chiefs, you could even argue, kind of had an influence from these guys. There's a lot of the Libertines. There's a lot of UK resonance that this album had, and I think it's because of that guitar sound. It just felt so transcendent of a particular scene, even though its lyrics were all about Julian's time in New York. It's very romantic, which is something else that Turn on the Bright Lights and Is This It share. There's this romantic sound to its lyrics that are, again, played very differently because of their sounds. Because while there's a sense of romance and whimsy to Is This It, Turn on the Bright Lights focuses so much more on misery and sadness, and that's fine. I love Turn on the Bright Lights as well. I love the sounds of this record. I love the reverb-soaked opening. Again, sort of gives this record this sort of stylistic intro that sort of lets the listener get washed over in the sounds before it builds and builds and throttles really well into Obstacle 1, one of the catchier moments on this record. And it has an incredible run from Obstacle 1 through Say Hello to Angels with these super anthemic moments, like on the title sake of the record in New York City, the allegories of hopping on couch to couch and stuff like that, while also having this super forlorn romantic twist on some of the lyrics. It's not too dissimilar from Is This It lyrically, for sure, but it definitely has this sense of sadness, the shoegazier moments that you could hear from bands like My Bloody Valentine, or more so like a Ride or a Slow Dive, especially Slow Dive. The mixing of drums and the guitar sounds on here feel very Slow Dive-esque in a very nice way. They do a good job at helping it pop more, and it's because of the fact that the rest of the band doesn't get washed away in the mix. That bass line pops on so many of these tracks and lets the band really feel as tight as a band like The Strokes, but in such a very, very different way. And it helps, again, that they have these vocals that are so unique. Paul Banks' vocals are so very tortured and pained. He's almost rattling at the mic, where Julian Casablancas has this sort of laid-back, fun nature to him. Paul Banks is the complete opposite. You feel some real pain in his voice that I just love hearing time and time again. And again, if we're talking about resonance, so many bands you could see burgeoning from this. The Killers, while they took a more new wave approach, that same sense of sadness in their sound itself could be kind of traced back to this. The XX as well, another band that you could really see pull from this. And I think it helps. Another thing that sort of shaped the sound of this record, because Is This It came out pre 9/11, and Turn on the Bright Lights seems like a good reflection of a post 9/11 New York. There's a sense of just dread and overlooming presence of sorrow that lingers throughout this record that I don't want to say was influenced by that, but it feels kinetically tied to it because it happened so far or so closely after that album dropped. There's this sense of dread that comes in Paul Banks' vocals while he's, harping on about his life in New York and the sorrow he feels over his obsessions of his lovers. It's incredible. I love Turn on the Bright Lights, and I love the sort of ambiguous nature of it as well, because, these songs, like the titles themselves, that opens with an untitled track, and then there's two obstacle songs that, again, kind of act as sort of adds to that ambiguity that the record has in it, but incredible record, Turn on the Bright Lights. It's as catchy as Is This It, but in such a very different way, and in a way that, again, shouldn't be overlooked. And it hasn't been. Both of these records are lauded, loads of praise in their respective scenes, or in the scene in general. The independent music scene loves, or the independent blogosphere loves Is This It and Turn on the Bright Lights. They're both critically praised out the ass because of what they did for music in their era. And it's incredible that both are, again, very lyrically similar, but sonically very different, and did so much more for their respective scenes. Now, as far as which one I prefer personally, I actually prefer Turn on the Bright Lights, but it's because I love the band's use of extended song passages and extended sounds of reverb and this big open atmosphere. And I'm a sucker for sad boy tunes. You guys know that. I love me some sad boy tunes. But like Stella Was a Diver and She Is Always Down is this incredible fucking song near the end of the record that gives the listener this full, lush experience. It's very raw in delivery, and I love it. It's not my favorite song on the record, but it embodies what I feel like sets it above an Is This It. While Is This It is laser focused and liquid tight, and I don't deny its incredible sounds. I don't deny its impact. That's why I've spent a lot of time giving a defense for it. I can't help but love the overall guitar tones on Turn on the Bright Lights. The bass just feels so fucking tight on here, and it provides a sound that I feel like was as necessary for the shaping of rock music, indie music in the 2000s as the Strokes' Is This It was. Because not only do I think it helped bring up bands like I had already mentioned, I feel like it helped shape other bands to get success in the decade, like Modest Mouse. While Modest Mouse was already on a train to mainstream success with The Moon in Antarctica and The Lonesome Crowded West, I feel like they would not have been given the same stage to work with if they didn't focus their sound in a similar way to Turn on the Bright Lights. A lot of the guitar sounds on Good News for People Who Love Bad News feels very reminiscent of some of the sounds on here. And I'm not knocking it for that. I love Good News for People Who Love Bad News more than Turn on the Bright Lights, but that's because I'm a huge fucking Modest Mouse fan. And I could be, just pulling at straws because, again, The Moon in Antarctica and Lonesome Crowded West are a perfect 1-2 punch. And I fucking love those records so much. And again, you could argue that was their big jumping on point, was The Moon in Antarctica. But the sounds in the general populace in the 2000s, I don't feel like would be in the same place to set up the success for a band like that if it were not for Manhattan's two juggernaut indie acts from the scene, is the Strokes and Interpol with their two respective records. I love, and I love the legacy of these bands as well. I love the stuff that they've dropped post this. I think the Strokes was more, or at least did a better job at expanding on their sounds than Interpol, but Interpol still pulled out some good shit in their run, but they definitely set themselves up for bigger success. Another band, Interpol, I feel like had to have had a shave for. Block Party. The reverb sadness on that record, while it's a lot dancier, and you could argue Block Party kind of melded the best elements of those two into Silent Alarm, which is why I like it more than both of these records. And of course, no AVA is complete without a poll breakdown, because you guys know I care about, I want to know what you guys think, in tandem with responding to comments from the previous podcast. I'm going to go over poll results from my Instagram, at Viral Rack, where I posted, this was actually the second poll I made, which again, this was going to be the first episode, but I was going to push it to later, but again, you guys know what's going on. But as far as the voting breakdown goes, a lot of you actually agreed with me, but it was again, a close poll. We had a 7-8 vote in favor of Turn on the Bright Lights, but again, the people that voted for the respective records that they voted for, I'm not as surprised. I know some of the people that voted for Is This It, that's more of their shtick, that's more of the sounds, that they go for, and the same goes for Turn on the Bright Lights. And then ultimately, I feel like in that regard, it does come down to preference, but I thought it was interesting that, like I said, I love these two records very dearly, and it is a close race. Even in the voting, it was incredibly close. But as far as my viewer polls go, or went when I made them, how long ago was this? When I made them 33 weeks ago, Is This It lost to Turn on the Bright Lights. But that may change. If I were to make it now, it could be different. Depends on who's really voting that day. But, yeah. I know both of these records have their own respective fan bases. I know a lot of people love the Strokes' Is This It and Interpol's Turn on the Bright Lights. And I almost sort of want to pass the question off to you. Which of these two projects do you prefer? Which do you think hits your ear better? Which do you think had the better influence? Which do you think was the bigger New York record to stem from the 2000s? Let me know in those comments down below. Obviously, I will address both of any questions you guys have, or any comments that kind of stand out in following episodes, in the beginning of the next episode, before I dive into the subject at hand. The next episode I do have on docket, it does have a guest with it. It is a longtime friend of the channel, and if he picks the topic, if he picks the one I pushed at him, you guys are in for a very special treat, and a much more niche topic than the ones that I presented in these first two. I wanted to keep both of the two episodes safe, talk about 90s records and 2000s records that both have their own huge respective audiences for very different reasons. And while I really love The Strokes and I really like Interpol, I just can't deny my love for Turn on the Bright Lights just a little bit more. But I know that it's also gonna generate conversation. I know that if anyone listens to this and they feel that passionately enough about Is This It, they'll make a good case for it. And I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what you think sets Is This It above Turn on the Bright Lights, because I do think it's a close race. I don't think it's an easy victory because of the things I said that make Is This It this just all out tour de force of rock. But again, I just like Turn on the Bright Lights more. But yeah, not next week, but the next episode that'll drop, I have a much more niche, fun topic to talk about that I think you guys will enjoy. If you did like this podcast, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons. If you would like to join their ranks and get early access to content, exclusive content, or help drive the community, it is linked in the description. Be sure to share this podcast with your friends as well. I do think that it's a fun concept. And again, it'll be even more fun with guests to jump in. Not every episode is going to be guest filled, but I hope you guys enjoy me sitting down and hashing out what I like about both of these records, what I think helps them stand out, their respective legacies, any sort of production things I want to throw in there, all that sort of stuff. I like to include that. But yeah, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you again so much for listening. I have been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, situations, and I'll see you another day.